Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Desolate Dynasty horror podcast. I am the narrator and host of this newly formed podcast, Joshua Clark. Through this podcast, I intend to release an episode in which I read off a story by myself or another interesting writer submission, weekly or bi-weekly. This week's episode is one of a significantly gruesome tale describing bad choices in jobs and dangers which are bound to sprout from that. If by some miracle enacted by the very hand of God this record is found, please bear in mind that my seeming atrocities were just. I am not a crazed man, even if this record seems to shew the contrary. Please enter reading this manuscript with an unbiased and uncondemning stance. I know, looking at the evidence, it will appear I have performed distasteful and extravagantly gruesome procedures. That I cannot presently disagree with. But it was not without the future of our world in mind. Even now, my hands, infused with the blood and bones and flesh of my colleagues, men and women I once called friends, tremble with such ferocity to make this ledger nigh unreadable. I know what I did, and what I continue to do, is all for the greater good of my fellow man. Even so, I acknowledge the extremes of my acts, and acknowledge that whoever may have obtained my written record will be apprehensive about believing me, but it had to be done. It was maybe 5 months ago when we begun studying this accursed structure, with its ruin-laden walls, decrepit, cracking stone. Me and my team of 5 more were called in to recover any writing or tools upon this plot of land. As you well know, this is a barren land of rock and rubble, barely more than 1,000 miles from New Zealand. It had been spotted purely due to a fluke by the hand of a cruise ship and her passengers. The tower was what alerted people first. The tower had begun to stick up from the water, inch by inch. It would be crazy to assume an island could rise from the water as it did. The conclusion many a men came to was crazier. The water seemed to manifest a divot 10 miles in diameter, roughly 5 in depth at the very center. I never saw the water level decrease incrementally as what was claimed to have happened, but by word of mouth, it was as though the tower snapped incrementally upwards, 5, 10, maybe 20 times at immense speeds. It was but 7 weeks since the tower and the barren rock which betrothed it had been spotted when my team of zoo biologists, 2 lighting and camera technicians, an archaeologist, myself, a microbiologist, and a chief executive field researcher, as he so demanded he be called, were given the go-ahead to enter the wave-licked portal revealed by the water which had receded in altitude. Our arrival was made by a small passenger ship holding myself, my 5 colleagues, and a 2-man ship crew. The indent seemed to oscillate at a nigh incomprehensive rate, but the waves which picked up just outside the divot made such an oscillation all too familiar. The salted ocean waves splashed our vessel's sides as we approached, bleaching every strand of hair on all our heads. The boat bounced as we approached the coordinates dictated to us by our employers, an archaeological company based within Finland, that managed to get the first dibs on the structure for reasons still unknown to me. At moments, I feared I would lose more than my hat, so I had accidentally released it from my head as I grabbed hold of railing with an especially high leap. The ship was not big, but neither was it tiny. Almost like a miniaturized cruise ship in design, it had aboard 5 double-bunk sleeping quarters, 2 storage facilities, a very small mess hall, 10 or 11 seats, and an engine room, all accessible through the hall. My bunkmate, the archaeologist, I had the decency to remember each of their names despite what I had to do, had been Carter Ritchie. He had been indifferent, as had I, on sharing a bunk with just about anybody. We had met once prior to embark, There had been no foul feelings for any reason between us, both of us being mild introverts, with little interest in lasting bonds. As such, when the zoo biologist, Leah Thompson, and the chief executive field researcher, Jonathan Taylor, both insisted on occupying room solo, there was no objection from I or Carter, the two-man ship crew. These two I never knew enough to recall their names, or the two light and camera technicians, Sarah Averly and Jarrett Bard, who had grown quite fond of each other through prior missions. Leah sat in a lounge chair conveniently nailed down to the bow of the ship, which she then leashed herself down with a rope she had carried in her luggage, as she said would be convenient in such a structure. She had been leafing through a book when we hit another of those repetitive high waves, which our ship sliced through but not without being lifted at a sudden lurch. She must have been sufficiently invested in the book, as she had only a second to snatch her book as it was taken by the wind. It fluttered through the air, colliding with the door to one of the storage rooms. After a brief exchange with Leah, her rope still lashing her down to the chair, I reluctantly ran for the novel. The vessel cut through and was lifted by a wave of especially high magnitude, as I had reached the door and used my right hand to grapple for the tome and left for the door. The first occurrence that made me regret this job was the increasingly frequent waves as we closed in on the structure. I had but a 5-second interval to cross the bow of the ship before the next, even more monumentous wave hit. My hand grappled for the closed umbrella, which I used to ground myself prior to the jog, slipping for a moment before, in a rash moment, I lost the book, using my other, drier hand to hold myself down. She quickly dismissed this error on my part, despite her novel joining my hat in the sea below the ship. Another maybe 10 minutes of small talk, the tower came into view. We noted the peculiar dip, only visible due to the level nature of a quiet ocean. It was, perhaps, the only reason I stayed after the first day of a projected 2 weeks trip. It is just as likely that I had fallen for the girl of a similar, quiet nature. Either reason, we had decelerated to make landfall at this peculiar rock. After another approximate 10 minutes, with a surprisingly less oscillation of waves, we unloaded the ship at the soaked and moldy-smelling portal of a number of the equipment. Our inventory had everything that made sense for determining whether a stay is safe: Geiger counter, air quality meter, and a thermometer. We placed these just inside the portal starting out, and the first expedition began. The archaeologist, never being the most active member, had been surprisingly the first to volunteer entering. His decision was followed by him donning a hazmat suit, with the other gear in a small bag as he entered. Watching the water from the very epicenter of the action was somehow more terrifying, as it seemed as though the water both receded and proceeded in altitude at the rate of a human heartbeat, though that might have been simple paranoia or superstitious alteration of observation. It took a suspenseful 10 minutes before he came back, slightly wide-eyed, and explained that there are no health risks, but it certainly wasn't a structure erected by a sane mind. The first thing my eyes locked on from entry was a bizarre painting, which, despite the musty, moldy smell, held most form from what it may have been finished. The painting had not been something I had been prepared for. A fat man atop a throne, in a hunched position, a crimson dye blotting his otherwise perfect strands of beard, which appeared to have been painted with pure gold. In his left hand he grasped a large volume, with lettering unreadable. At his right, the entrails of what one may only guess to be. There had been incomprehensive assortment of runes along the wooden frame, also not rotted, despite the moldy smell, which resembled not a rune language ever seen by either I or any other in my party. The eyes seemed to create an aura of pure hunger and malevolence. Every other hair on his naked body had been an identical golden color. His belly, stuffed with the entrails of whatever on God's earth it may be, seemed to glisten with the golden tints of hair. What made the image much more distorted than any of the other demonic features was how the face, around the mouth and nose region, seemed to extrude from the general surface, forming an inhuman snout to the man who sat atop the throne within the frame above our heads. Jonathan and I transported the luggage from aboard into the structure. I stood at the entrance, silently catching and placing down the individual bags, miscellaneous items. The two technicians waited exuberantly for their supplies to capture photos of the diabolical structure. After nearing 13 minutes of toss and catch, the technicians ran off with their cameras and lights. They failed to grab their backup power supplies, but the battery supplied within the equipment was quite enough for a general perimeter capture. Another 7 or so minutes of this trivial toss and catch before the two of us felt sure about everybody's equipment and personal luggage. I climbed aboard the ship myself, gave a final check, and gave the two-man ship crew the go-ahead on departure. The intention was 2 weeks. 2 weeks unless we alerted our employers with a small radio they dispatched us with that we needed immediate help and we could return home. For the first week I hadn't a clue why our employers chose to send a microbiologist or a zoobiologist, but I have since come to believe they knew. That may be just paranoid accusations, however, as I have no evidence to such claims. It was about 5 days after arrival that things began to be a bit off. It was Carter who first exhibited symptoms of the reason I was sent on this mission. Unmistakably, there had been small yellow hairs sprouting from his nose and below it. I noticed these when he had collapsed during an expedition to one of the adjacent rooms. It was brought back by the two technicians who followed him in to give him lighting. The zoobiologists and I had been nose deep in our respective books, and Jonathan had been at the entrance unloading his bladder. Our party of 4 placed him atop a cot, and I demanded a light. First guess was dehydration, though he seemed to be responsible enough. The mostly chilly temperature made it seem unlikely as well, especially since he embarked with a full canteen for himself and additional canteens with either technician. While the other technicians dragged one of their interior lights across the floor, Jarrett threw off his t-shirt, which was glistened with a revolting green-yellow bile expelled by Carter. Carter groaned as the light shimmered on his pale face and revealed the desolate hairs speckling his nose, which bore a bizarre yellow gold, quite unlike his dark and puffy black hair which matted his head. I quickly called for water from Sarah, who handed her canteen off to me. Both technicians seemed to be quite rattled by the sudden collapse of their colleague, especially given the prior lack of symptoms, but this was nothing compared to the falling reaction. After attempting to down a bit of the canteen, Carter started convulsing and hurling once again. It was hardly liquid what came out, but more of those yellow hairs. Thousands of those putrid hairs fell to the ground beside his cot, almost like a cat's hairball, hurled up when disrupting their digestive system. He snatched up the canteen once more and tried drowning down another wave of those hairs before I had to step back not to hurl myself. Leah had likely been the only one who didn't nearly vomit as well, though she was certainly perturbed by the image before her. She demanded a sample be collected of the hairs. After a short wheeze and a bit of a haze, I reached down before she barked not to touch it. My experience in microbiology should have made that glaringly obvious, but my hand was but 1 inch from the pile by the time Jonathan's own vomiting from the image snapped me back. I shook the haze from my mind, grabbed from my supplies a pair of tweezers and a sample tube, transferred a small tuft of the golden yellow pile of hairs into the tube. After placing the tube down on my work desk I had unfolded a few days prior, I stumbled over to the scene once more. By this point, Jonathan had wiped off his own bile and demanded a report from the two supporting technicians. There was no knowledge they could confess to, however, as all they had seen was his collapse and initial bile projection. As for how this affliction started, or what the hairs were, they had as little clue as the rest of us. With that said, they did note some earlier symptoms. These entailed nothing more than shortness of breath, a reluctancy to talk, but it was easy to assume that that was nothing more than his nature. His overwhelming desire to venture deeper into this catacomb were still obscure. It is, once more, notable, I never did know him personally. It is perfectly plausible his aversion to speaking, but genuine boldness when struck with curiosity is a normal reaction of his. Regardless, it is noteworthy as a possible symptom. When struck with this lack of information, a sense of paranoia set in. The light shining upon Carter's face revealed a new symptom, as it seemed the hairs not only generated from within the digestive tract of the afflicted, but on the exterior of the body as well. Several hairs could be seen upon the bridge of his nose, as well as scattered across his cheeks. The hairs that seemed to sprout from the traditionally inexistent follicles were most prominent over top the nose. It was not a stupefying number, but it certainly was enough for an alteration in color within the area. It was of my own thought to remove one with the tweezers used before. Pitching and pulling, a single strand was removed from his nose. The length was truly what was stupefying. There was a snapping sound within as it was removed, and a certain tenseness was in the air emitting from my colleagues. I was still a bit uncertain whether I removed the hair in its entirety, but what appeared prior to be nothing more than an inch now made it up to be 5 inches. Towards the end, it seemed to branch out. I later learned this branching makes up a root system within the afflicted. Though seemingly unconscious, the snapping of the hair caused Carter to stir in his cot. I took a step back after disregarding the hair into the puddle of bile. Leah soon followed. She avoided getting too close, though we held an adequate dialogue. To the two of us, it seemed the two technicians were most likely next to fall under the weather. Transmission was uncertain at this point, but the hairs seemed to be the most likely candidate. There had been quite a few of those hairs in the bile coughed up by Jarrett's shirt, and if the hair themselves were merely a byproduct and not a vector of transmission, Carter's vomit seemed to be the next most likely scenario. Nearly a day went by with no rouse from Carter, though the hairs became much more prominent and more frequent. By the second night, his face seemed completely shrouded in yellow hairs, and underneath seemed to take on a new shape. It was a medium between the face of a man and that of a mouse. It was elongated only slightly. There had been times in the night where he would wake up in a wheezing fit, gasping for air as his nasal passages warped from what they were naturally meant to be. On the second night since his collapse, the 7th in all, he was gone. The cot was stained with more bile than before, sweat, hairs, and blood. There were only 2 possibilities of his escape route. He could have delved into the water and attempted to swim, or be washed away, or he could have run through the seeming labyrinth that was this structure. Him and the technicians had been the only ones exploring deeper into this accursed sanctum, but one was missing, one was in hysterics, and one wouldn't talk. The first of the symptoms were shewed within Jarrett, though I was suspicious the hairs had begun to sprout prior to his zipped mouth. The search for Carter had to wait, as studying Jarrett seemed more pressing and safer. There were no adequate quarantine methods within this keep, and as such, after an unanimous vote, Jarrett voting in favor, through a wave of his hand as opposed to words, it was decided we would transfer Jarrett to one of the adjacent rooms, with alternating party members keeping watch. Leah and I discussed the likelihood of Sarah's affliction of this illness, and judging by how close Sarah and Jarrett always were, it was a certainty. We pulled Jonathan aside and warned him of our assessment. Another wave of paranoia set over everyone, before we finally thought to contact our employers. It was a tense moment after the first words spoken by Jonathan, calling out the name of Elmanov, the one who was on the other side of the radio, before there was finally a static pop and a croak demanding why the call was sent out. The bizarre sprouting pathogen was described to the operator, who, now more awake than before, promised a disease team at the cavern entrance, cut the conversation short. Another moment of tenseness onset as we awaited Elmanov to return. The speaker once again popped, and we were given a notice of 2 entire days before we would be pulled from this purgatory. The hope this communication brought was quickly extinguished, as the following night the portal was gone. The entrance, that had been there for the entire week of our stay, now was submerged entirely with water. It could have been oddly satisfying under different circumstances, as the water made but a flowing wall which seemed nigh solid whilst also living. A pulsation could be resolved from this wall of substantial force, and when one placed their hand in it, seemed to pull both downwards and inwards, as if wanting to pull the observer from this demonic tube. Oxygen never seemed to be an issue. Judging by the whistling which emanated from within the cavern, one might assume oxygen is pumped in and carbon dioxide is pumped out via the tower, so expertly built upwards from the structure. It was Jonathan, having been stationed over Jarrett during the night, who exclaimed in shock when he heard a rumbling and watched as the structure submerged, that awoke the rest of us. The water only occasionally splashed into the portal, dampening it, but never flooding it. The structure held the precise quantity of atmosphere needed to keep the structure from flooding, via simultaneously pushing and pulling air from the system. We had been foolish and dumbstruck during this occurrence, and as such, we never saw Jarrett leave the dead-end room he had been staying within. Fresh blotches of blood and fur leading us deeper into the structure, which no one had entered since Carter's collapse. The blotches eventually degraded and disappeared into nothing, and no one was certain at this point where to go, as a strong flashlight held by myself shewed a total of 3 branching tunnels. Each one glistened with droplets of blood splattered against the wall, as well as the hairs. It was the center which held within it a clump of hair, which were most likely the bile of Jarrett, that revealed to us a grim image. Though mostly covered in fur, laying away inwards of the tunnel, was Jarrett. He was much worse off than any of us were expecting. His entrails, which were speckled with a substantial number of hairs, were stretched from his body and led to an oddly recognizable throne. Betrothed atop the throne, which I trained my flashlight on for far too long, was another recognizable image. Grasped in his left hand was the stomach or liver of Jarrett. His right beheld a large book with unintelligible runes on the front, and blood soaked his face. A creature with the body of a man, yellow with fur, face stretched and contorted like a rat, with a nose which flattened off at the end like a pig, stared scornfully and malevolently at myself and the remaining members of my party. First thought was of the painting which hung and judged us from atop the entrance. The creature which watched us now had watched us from the beginning, I thought. The next thought I had was the clothes Carter wore before his disappearance into the cavern. The creature wore a blooded vest, t-shirt, and a cargo pants, all of which I recalled Carter wearing. The obvious conclusion from there was this monstrous, disproportionate being which wished death upon us from atop the moldy chair he sat in was, in fact, the same Carter we walked into this twisted structure with. The finale of a desperate mind's thought was of home. I disliked my own lonely apartment, with nothing but a bedroom, a bathroom, and a small cubby for a kitchen. But that was all my job as a professor was able to afford. My decision to partake in this gig was made after I was directly approached by this corporation by the name of Archaic Delegate, with a handsome payment and promise of future employment in events requiring the field of microbiology. More research should have been put into this group, as it seemed to me at that moment that they didn't prepare me for this, despite perhaps expecting it. During this final thought, my wrist was grabbed, and I was pulled from my trance. I moved the light from the creature, who was now initiating a tantrum. An inhuman gurgle scream was heard from behind us, as I increased my own speed. Jonathan was ahead of us by a while. Leo was holding my wrist and was dragging me ahead, and Sarah had lost a bit of momentum and was lagging. The creature gurgled and coughed once more and seemed to slack a bit. When we reached the lobby of our dungeon, we had lost the creature by a mile, which gave us but a second to catch our breath. A new fear unset us, as we were all within the lobby and light shone on Sarah's face. Her nose took on a new yellow tint. It was obvious it was too late for her. It was a putrid thought, but the only thought anyone had on the matter. The hairs generate a root system underneath the skin, which connects to the nervous system and digestive system. The hairs seem to first appear on the nose and make their way through the body, If one were to remove them when they first generate, it may be possible to avoid complete affliction. After a talk with Leah, she looked over Sarah and confirmed not a single other location beheld the hairs yet. It was tweezers that I first tried. The hairs were much too brittle and snapped much too short to be effective. The other option was what I wanted to avoid, and I was nauseated by such a thought. A scalpel was the next option. Remove the skin of the nose, remove the hairs from the body of the infected. In the end, when I brought up the option to the party, Sarah requested it be done. She felt lost without that lifelong friend, but at the same time it seemed obvious the end result of this affliction was what Carter had become. I donned a pair of rubber gloves and yielded the scalpel. She laid on a cot, unused by either of the infected, and clenched her eyes shut in anticipation. I choose to abstain from describing the procedure, but it seemed to be successful for a while. Not another hair appeared outside for the day, or the day after. We'd attempted contact via the radio, but as it seemed, we never could get a report out. Likewise, we could never receive an update. A small analog clock was the only way to know what hour it was, as light was refracted much too much by the time it reached the cavern entrance. It wasn't until 3 tense days after the first procedure that Sarah's face brandished another gruesome shade of yellow. Judging by the 2 prior cases, the hairs take normally just a day to spread out after the first are seen on the nose. She practically begged, though still in pain from the previous procedure, for me to continue. I passed a pleading look to Leah, who stared blankly before she closed her eyes and nodded. Her face was constructed of no skin by the end of it, though no more hairs could be seen within. A full face mask of a cast was placed around it. She was left alone by all of us. She cried the following 2 nights, and on the 3rd, she went under the weather due to an infection. Decontamination was not done properly, it seemed. A substantial amount of medical alcohol was applied to the opening of her flesh, but in the end, it wasn't due to the monster-generated illness that she died. It was also possible she choked her own bile, but an infection was just as likely, and none of us remaining 3 felt willing to perform an autopsy. Jonathan's story wasn't substantially better. How he got infected, I am uncertain, but he requested the same procedure. I didn't feel as much shame with the defiling of his face, but doing such a putrid thing to any other human being still ended the sense of dignity I still felt. All previous steps were taken, though his mouth was left uncovered by the bandages, and he mentally lasted another 2 days as compared to Sarah. Physically, he was fine until the 4th day after the second procedure, though he had mentally broken. He spouted inhuman syllables and cried out for an artifact called the Thayer of Grimoire, in a voice that wasn't his own, before spewing a bile of hairs and going mute. Leah's decision was to finish him. No one wanted to become what he had. No one should. So, a dosage of chemicals was used to euthanize his devolving form. In the end, I couldn't do that part. Because of this, Leah fell victim to the sickness. I couldn't do any more at that point. I'd done too much. I couldn't hold myself together. She defiled her own face, removed her nose, as I learned the morning after her infection. The second procedure she could not complete. Doing her face in was what finally ended it for me. She lasted the same time as Jonathan, and I watched her degradation. I watched as she became something other than human. I compiled the same chemicals, and I was the one who did her in. It was that point that I decided the end of the nightmare was approaching. I removed 2 legs of the desk I had set up the first day, and on what had to have been the 28th day at least, I entered the cavern and bludgeoned the beast. I approached it in its sleep and bashed its head in continually until nothing resembling a brain could animate the body that was Carter Ritchie. I hobbled back to the lobby like a dog with its tail between its legs. I now sit in a throne of my own, writing a warning to whoever may find this construct. The desk was useless without its legs, but I have found another support for writing this ledger. I have removed my nose after I spotted the hairs, but never removed my face. I've had much more time than needed to reflect upon my experience and feel my mind slipping towards a darker place. What follows this slip, I wish not to know. I have already prepared my end and expect the bliss from this world will beat the bliss from the other. The only thing I wish to know before my end is of the Therv Grimoire, but I fear humoring the thought will lead me down a path like Carter, and so I should end my journey here. My knuckles show a yellow-gold color, and I can only imagine what the follicles in the lower portion of my body contain.